Yeah, good afternoon. This is Legal Angle with Emmanuel the Law Holloway. I have with me this afternoon Jake Mallory. Welcome to the show, Jake.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Can you introduce yourself to the audience? Tell them what you do, who you are.
Sure. My name is Jake Mallory. I am a deputy prosecuting attorney for Kittitas County here in Washington State. I graduated from the University of Washington, and all of my legal experience has been in prosecutors' offices. But I'm here in Washington State now, in central Washington. It's a very small community that I serve.
Thank you. Today we'll be talking about the issue of police reform. For the past 1 month, we've had these protests all across the country and some even somewhere all over the globe, as a result of the death of Floyd. Sorry, Jake. George Floyd,
Yes.
and Breonna Taylor, and then Aubrey. So I wanted to talk to you to see, as a prosecutor, having to deal with day in, day out, you deal with, with the police, you deal with even litigants, you deal with defense counsel and defendants. Um, what do you think about police reform? Do you think it's something we need right now, or do you think it's something that we have to wait a few years for, or it's long overdue?
I think that police reform is something that should have been happening years ago, decades ago, but certainly with the advent of technology, and we are getting more and more videos of unarmed black men being killed. Certainly, at least for the last 6 or 7 years, where we have so much evidence coming in that there are these things happening. These conversations should have happened at least 7 to 10 years ago, and arguably more, but we didn't have the same kind of visceral footage that we did 30 or 40 years ago that we're seeing now.
So you don't think that the videos we're seeing now, you don't think that the what we're seeing now are new? It's just that we're seeing them because we have videos recording them.
Oh, absolutely. I think, all you have to do is open a history book and we see, I think that chances are the violence that we're seeing now has reduced with all of the information that's coming to light, but we haven't had such access to cameras, videos. We have them built into our phones. We take our phones everywhere now, that we're able to capture more of this behavior and document it, where we weren't able to do that. And we had to simply rely on the first person stories that we would hear. And it allowed people the opportunity to say that didn't happen, or you're exaggerating. And not everyone had an outlet like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter to get their story out there. And
That
now
is,
we do.
you're right, because most of these cases, especially the George Floyd case that sparked this protest, people were able to see the video, the 9 minutes of horror. Without that video, it's highly likely that a police report will not have actually indicated what happened.
Right. And we see that with the Breonna Taylor case, where
Correct.
we've finally got police reports, but the police reports are minimal at best. We know that Breonna Taylor was shot, I believe it's 8 times, but in the
Eight
police
times.
reports, they don't indicate that she was injured at all during this
Hmm.
incident. So without that footage, I don't think that we would be where we are. But I also don't think that without COVID-19 going on right now, that we would be where we are either. I have been looking, and I've been discussing with some of my colleagues, why is this happening now, when I believe it was 7 years ago, we had
Mhm.
basically the same footage of Eric Garner It was a
Correct.
chokehold and not a knee, but it was still for a de minimis crime. George Floyd was accused of a counterfeit $20 bill, and Eric Garner was accused of selling loose cigarettes without them being taxed. And we had this really ugly video of Eric Garner being murdered at the hands of police, but we didn't have rioting. We didn't have the kinds of protests that we're having now. And I kind of question if the fact that so many people are being given paid time off or are on unemployment and have the opportunity to stay home, that they have the ability to engage in this dialogue, where 7 years ago we didn't have that opportunity.
I think you're right. I think it's a combination of all that, because during the stay at home issue too with COVID-19, a lot of people have been watching Netflix, and Netflix have been showing series of documentaries that has to do with wrongful convictions, wrongful arrest, and in fact, wrongful miscarriage of justice. So a lot of people were fed up, and to crown that, the moment the country was supposed to reopen, the same week, we saw that video, which is just like, you know what? This is like the last straw that broke the camel's back. So people just went out in the street. They don't care even if they catch COVID. And I think to a large extent, the protest has made some progress, because Congress is now they're now talking about police reform, but they are now at an impasse. What do you think about that?
What do I think about what specifically?
About Congress not being able to pass a bill or being able to pass a police reform bill?
It doesn't really surprise me. For years, we have had politicians who have been getting quick political bucks on encouraging stronger police forces and zero tolerance policies, with ideas being that if we allow these small crimes to happen, those will lead to bigger crimes. And it's not just Republicans, it's not just Trump, it's not just George Bush. We saw the same thing with Bill Clinton promising to put an additional 100,000 police officers out on the streets. And especially with the extreme divisiveness that this administration has put us in, I don't anticipate seeing anything happening from the legislature at least this year. It's going to have, if anything happens, it's going to have to take place on a local level, or it's going to have to take place through the judicial system.
Yeah, that's exactly. I think you're quite right. Even I'm also looking at it from the point of view of the 10th Amendment. Even if they pass a reform, they can enforce it on the states without attaching it to a spending bill. Right. So are we just having a political theater? Shouldn't it be left to the local authorities, like the cities and the municipalities, to handle this?
Well, I think in a way it is up to them. But the more interesting question is, should it be up to them? Because we need reform on a federal scale. And police reform, just like everything else, is being increasingly politicized. And if we leave it to municipalities, to states, to counties to enact these police reforms, then assuming that anyone is successful, we're going to end up seeing large disparities between cities, between counties, and between states, depending on whether or not the governing bodies of those local areas want to or don't want to reform their police, or if they, in fact, based off of all of this, have one of those counter reactions where they are actually encouraging more police on the streets, which is not something that I've heard yet from any local district, but I see it as a possibility.
I think you're right. What do you think about the ban of chokehold? Do you think that should be across the board, or do you think they need to do more? Because some communities have actually passed laws banning chokeholds.
I think it's a very rare circumstance where a chokehold is going to be the appropriate method for restraining an individual, especially as a trained officer. You are trained in a variety of techniques to subdue a person, and it's very rare that chokeholds are going to be the appropriate method for that. I question a little bit the effectiveness of banning chokeholds, particularly given qualified immunity and the very strict guidelines that the Supreme Court has set out by which courts must follow. So with qualified immunity, I'm sure that you're aware, but currently, in order to overcome qualified immunity, the plaintiff or the state must show that not only is there a rule against the conduct that an officer has taken, but that ban, that law has to be fact specific. So the laws that we have for everyone, for everyday civilians, we can make simple laws like don't kill people. And that's something that everyone can kind of get behind. But with qualified immunity, we have these rules that say you have to have a fact-specific rule banning this conduct. And courts have been very, very strict about parsing these lines, where very de minimis differences in a factual circumstance will make or break qualified immunity. And so a blanket ban against chokeholds, I don't know, is going to be very effective if there's no means by which to enforce the ban.
Correct. How about the elimination of personal immunity of police officers?
When you say the ban of personal immunity, do you mean the ban of qualified immunity?
Qualified immunity, yeah, of police officers, yes.
Well, I'm not an abolitionist when it comes to qualified immunity. Qualified immunity does not just apply to police officers. It applies to all public officials. It applies to your legislators. It applies to police officers, your judges. It applies to people like me who are prosecutors. And the idea, I think, behind this qualified immunity is that when you are in one of these positions, you are not acting as an individual. You are acting as a part of this concept that we call the state. And when you're acting on behalf of the state, you're doing things that you as a person would not do. And so I think that there's some room for some parsing about how far we should go in qualified immunity. But back when we first started talking about, and when I say we, I mean as a nation or as a court system.
Yes.
When we started applying qualified immunity to police officers, it was back in, I believe, 1967, in Pearson v. Ray. What the Supreme Court did was they said a public official acting in good faith will benefit from qualified immunity. And I think that makes sense. If you are acting in a way to benefit the state, benefit the community, or in a way that you believe is going to do that, and you're acting in good faith, then we're not going to prosecute you. We're not going to allow you to be sued. But in 1982, the Supreme Court flipped that on its head and said, it's not enough that you're acting in good faith. The state has to prove that you were very clearly told that this specific conduct was banned. And it has to be fact specific. And it's not just enough for you to say that you know that this was inappropriate conduct, but the dumbest, the least educated, still reasonable officer, if he did not know, then we're still not going to hold you accountable, even if you specifically knew. And that's such a heavy burden for any plaintiff to bear. It's too much.
Correct. Do you think maybe by prolonging the length of trainings of officers, maybe it can help to abate some of these errors or malpractice we see on the streets?
I don't know. Back when Eric Garner died, we started having a national dialogue, and it's not the same dialogue that we're having now. It was a lot more tame.
Correct.
But I was, that was 2014. I have some law enforcement in my family. I have been working with law enforcement, and I started trying to have conversations because it's very clear that we need to train officers in de-escalation techniques. It's very clear that we need to teach them restraint and all of these many, many things that an officer needs. We expect a lot out of them, and they need the proper training for that. And right now, you can become an officer with, I think it's a 3 or 4 month basic training.
Yes.
You know, I'm a criminal lawyer. I went through 4 years of undergrad. I went through 3 years of law school, and I got out of law school, and I still didn't know what I was doing when it came to criminal law and criminal procedure. Exactly. And yet we run officers through 3 or 4 months worth of training, and it's not all about how do you do a good job and how do you know when to execute these search warrants and all of those things, but it's you know, how to identify drugs, how do you operate your speed measuring device, how do you shoot. There's so much time spent on shooting ranges, and so it's not this condensed course about criminal law. But after these 3 or 4 months, we send them on their way, and we expect them to know what we're doing. And if you and I can't do that as attorneys with 7 years minimum of schooling, how do we expect these people to do it? So I was chatting, this is a long roundabout way to get where I was going. I was chatting with some officers when Eric Garner was killed. And I was discussing them. No, it's very clear that we need to run our officers through some remedial training regarding better techniques than for your first impulse to go to a chokehold or to draw your gun. We need de-escalation techniques. And the response that I got from so many of the police officers was, why should I be punished for something that an officer in New York did? Now, you and I, we're attorneys. I believe that you're licensed and practicing, which means that even though we've gone through 7 years worth of training, every year we have to get a certain number of continuing legal education courses. Our learning is not done. We are constantly going through training.
Exactly.
And I look forward to it. If there's something that I am doing as a prosecutor that I could be doing better, and I can bring that to the table in my negotiations with defense attorneys, if I can bring it to trial, if I can do any of those things, I'm going to jump at that chance. But so many of the officers that I was speaking with viewed this as a punishment. And I question whether or not some additional remedial trainings are going to be effective at all, as long as there is the mentality that you are going to this training as a punishment for something that someone else did. Is anything that they're going to learn in those trainings going to stick with them? I kind of don't think so.
Wow. So it seems we're dealing with some kind of systemic failure. Even just a few weeks ago, I posted on my Facebook page. I was like, every police officer should be meant to at least audit a criminal procedure class in law school, even if it's just to be for a whole semester, for a whole session, maybe 10 classes, 15 classes, because you see some of these videos and right away as an attorney, that's an illegal stop. That's a violation of Fourth Amendment rights, but they don't know the law. How can they enforce it? So we as a society, when it comes to training our police officers, maybe we are doing ourselves a disfavor by sending officers out there without adequate training, without adequate knowledge of the law, without adequate training, and just giving them guns and the power to choke people.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about the idea of, I think you already answered that. You think they will see it as a punishment. What do you think about the idea of, instead of sending those who are already police officers to those trainings, how about those who are coming in to change the old system, part of the overhaul, have them take criminal procedure class, have them teach them the escalation, teach them how to manage mental health patients, not patients, but people they encounter with, because sometimes too they encounter people that have mental health issues, but they're not trained to de-escalate. What do you think of putting all those into what they learn before they get the license or before they get the badge?
Well, I think that that's something that we should have been doing for a long time. I question, and maybe this would end up being a good thing, but I kind of question how many police officers would stick through all of that training. Especially, I believe that being an officer only requires you to have a GED.
Yes, GED.
And so taking them and putting them into a criminal procedure class without any of that background is a little bit concerning. I also, but maybe that's what we need to weed out some of the officers who are ultimately going to be less qualified to be doing that job. But I also think that there's an adage: a fish stinks from the head down. And without what ultimately is going to happen, assuming that we were to do this and we were to put these officers into these classes, is they would go to these classes and then they would go on field rides. And you would have these senior officers who have not gone through that same training saying, you may have learned X, but let me tell you from personal experience, this is what it is that we need to do. And so without a more structural reform, I don't think that just sending new blood in with more information is going to do what we want it to do.
So overall, we may have to overhaul the whole force. Even then, the veterans who may have to be forced to, just like we go to CLEs, they may just have to train them. It's better for everybody, because if you look at it, if all the 4 officers now that were there when George Floyd was killed, their life will never be the same, even if they don't get convicted. So if it's framed in a way that, we're not punishing you, we're trying to protect you, because especially if you look, the temperature has changed. Now you have more people backing police reform. So if something like that can be done, it will even protect officers too, because officers also wants to go home to their families. But at the same time, they encounter you, they encounter me, they encounter anyone else. We also want to go back home to our family. So that structural change might be what we need. What do you think about the idea of outfitting all officers with body cams and dash cam on their car, on their sport cars, on their motorcycles, or whatever? Just body cams, and those body cams cannot be turned off when they have encounters with the public. What do you think of that idea?
I think that at this point, that should be standard operating procedure. Unfortunately, it's not. I think that at this point, best guess is most to all officers have dash cams. But body cam technology, it's not new, but it's new by police standards. And despite how much we are funding police, we are not funding all police districts the same. I know that in my district, one city in my county has instituted body cams as of this year, but the remaining cities here and the county and our particular detachment of state troopers, none of them have body cams. And it's something that in my discussions with some of the higher ups, they are interested in, but they have yet to find that money in the budget.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
At least that's what they tell me. I haven't actually looked at the numbers.
Okay. And then, okay. Then the issue of the federal government sending military equipment to local police officers. I think, what do you think about stopping that? Because initially, when that started, it started after 9/11.
Right.
And the only reason they did that was just in case, because we don't know if we're going to have another 9/11. We don't want our police forces to be ill-equipped. But now we haven't had another attack. But now the same guns meant for foreign terrorists are being turned on civilians. What do you think about either stopping, giving them military equipment and using the money for that to get body cams so that all officers will at least have body cams? Because I think we need more cameras than we need more guns.
No, I agree with you. We definitely need more cameras than we need guns. I don't want to be someone who suggests that police officers should be ill-equipped for the situations that they may find themselves in. But I also look at so much of the footage that we've seen and say, we have police in riot gear using military equipment to handle crowd control against people who have their hands up. So I don't know what I think about that. I really don't think that there are going to be many situations where military equipment's going to need to be used by the police. I think that we are overusing the equipment that they have. Whether or not we should stop altogether is not something that I've really considered.
Okay. Yeah, I'm much more, if I were to be asked, I'm much more of the middle ground about, okay, we can give them those military equipment. However, they can only use those equipment when they have maybe a 9/11 issue and not against Americans. Because otherwise, it's like we have our own internal civil war against the police department. People carrying waters or sticks or cards, and then you have all these riot gears officers looking as if they're going to war.
Right.
But then we can manage it. We don't because at the same time we don't want the officers to feel like they don't have the equipment to deal with the crowd. However, they can have that equipment, but they can't use it against Americans. Because otherwise, it even makes the department look bad. Even look at the optics. Even if they never fired a shot. You see someone wearing a t-shirt, and then you see the people on the other side looking like they're at war. What do you think?
I think that makes sense. I I struggle sometimes with absolutes, saying, there is no situation in which you can use this equipment against Americans. It sounds like a good idea, but I also cannot conceive of all possible scenarios. So maybe there is a situation that someone could put in front of me that I would say, yeah, maybe. But strict rules governing the use of this, and part of those strict rules being don't use them at peaceful protests, I think make a lot of sense.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to say. I think you framed it the right way, because we might have a situation where we have even local terrorists. And with local terrorists, we will have to be treated as if because they're the enemy of the state.
Right.
The fact that you're American doesn't make you less dangerous if you're going to go around killing people, randomly or indiscriminately. So
Right.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. So maybe if you have a situation where we have that rule that you can't use this against peaceful protesters, but you have that event where they can use it against local terrorists, then what do you think about the no-knock warrants? Because with no-knock warrants itself, I believe when you send officers out there to enforce that,
Right.
I personally believe you put them in harm's way. Because when you have civilians with Second Amendment rights who legally owns guns, then you send officers out there to go in and just knock the door and break the door down, doesn't that, that's a potential messy situation because officers are going to shoot back.
Right. Yeah. And I think that we've seen that a little bit. Breonna Taylor comes to mind. At the same time, no-knock warrants were originally intended to protect officers and to protect evidence of misdeeds, criminal acts. And no-knock warrants were only issued, and I believe still are supposed to be only issued, when an officer is able to articulate why this needs to be a no-knock warrant. There's some evidence that may be destroyed if given the residents time to answer the door. So I don't know. I don't know. Even if we were to eliminate no-knock warrants, knock and announce is this really fluid idea where in criminal law, a criminal procedure, even if you have a warrant that requires you to knock and announce, if something happens that makes you believe that your suspect is escaping, that they are destroying evidence, you don't have to wait for them to come to the door. A simple knock, knock, police, and then bang through the door is something that the law contemplates. Yes. So I don't know how much elimination of no-knock warrants is going to help anyone, given that even with a knock and announce requirement, 3 seconds is all that you need to wait. And I think that with no-knock warrants, the premise that you offered me was for police safety. And I think in some situations, there's a good argument for that. We have people with Second Amendment rights with guns in their homes. And if suddenly someone is bursting through their home without knocking and announcing, officers may very well find themselves faced with a resident with a gun in their hand. The alternative perspective on that is if executing a no-knock warrant, it gives the resident in the home less time to get their gun. because just because the police are at your door does not mean that they are not going to get shot at. So I don't know. I tend to side on eliminating the no-knock warrants, but I think that there is also more reason behind the no-knock warrants than some pundits give credit for.
Yeah. I understand the reasons behind it, and I just believe it puts everyone in harm's way. The officers, the homeowners, it's dangerous, and you never know what can happen. Either way, if in a situation like the Taylor case, you have innocent civilians, and you also have innocent officers. One way or the other, people got shot.
Yeah.
Hopefully with the debate going on, we'll be able to figure out something. But definitely, we need some kind of reform, and we need more education for officers. We need more trainings, and because we can't keep on doing the same thing and expect a different result.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you, Jake, for coming on Legal Angle. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you again for taking the time.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me.
This is it on Legal Angle with Emmanuel De La Olawale for this Saturday. Join me again next week for another episode of Legal Angle. Thank you.